All right, Andrew, it is time to finally land the plane on this series, We Who Wrestle with Jordan Peterson, which has been a critical review of Peterson's latest book, We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine. Now, we've come to the final chapter of the book, and what we'll do here is just have a look at this chapter, and then we'll turn to some final reflections on the work as a whole. So let me start off by taking us through chapter 9. Chapter 9 is titled Jonah and the Eternal Abyss. Now, up until this point, Peterson has focused most of his attention on the Torah, on the first 5 books of the Old Testament, with, periodic forays into other biblical texts. In this chapter, he's going to jump forward to the book of Jonah, and he does this in order to, it seems to me, in order to close the circle on a theme that he introduced in the foreshadowing chapter with the story of Elijah. And we'll see this in a minute. But before we look at this, let me just briefly summarize the Jonah story. So Jonah, the Israelite, is called by God to carry a message of repentance to Israel's sworn enemies, the Assyrians. And this doesn't sit well with Jonah. And so instead of traveling to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, as commanded by God, Jonah boards a ship and heads in the opposite direction. He heads towards Tarshish in an attempt to flee from God and from God's command. And of course, the attempt to run away fails when God sends a storm to arrest the ship's journey. Jonah is eventually thrown overboard and swallowed by a great fish. And while in the belly of the fish, Jonah repents and recommits to the call of God. And then after 3 days, he's released from the great fish, makes his way to Nineveh, where he calls the city to repentance. The people and the leaders end up responding to that call, and the city is saved from divine judgment. Now, as I said, I think Peterson's using the story of Jonah to bookend his project by returning to the very first characterization of the divine that he drew from the story of Elijah in the foreshadowing chapter of the book. If you recall from our introductory episode in this series, the first characterization of God offered by Peterson, and what seems to me to be the primary and controlling characterization of God throughout the rest of the book, is God as still small voice, as God is the still small voice of conscience. So in this closing chapter, Peterson is returning to this fundamental characterization. And from the story of Jonah, Peterson is going to derive both a warning and he's going to give us an exhortation, both of them being related to the central motif of the divine voice of conscience. So the warning in the Jonah story is basically this. We ignore the voice of conscience, the voice of the divine, to our own peril, both as individuals and as a society. And we see this motif exemplified in Jonah. Jonah's refusal to head in the direction that God calls him to, or to heed the divine voice and to speak the divine word, puts him and those around him in danger of the abyss. And the moral of the story is that to refuse to listen to the voice of conscience when it commands us to speak the divine word is to invite calamity and hell into our lives and into the lives of people around us. So like Jonah, each of us bears this divine responsibility to hold back the horrors of the abyss and of hell, individually and collectively, by heeding the voice of conscience and by speaking the divine truth. To be silent when the voice of God calls is to doom ourselves and our society to a living hell of our own making. And this, for Peterson, is worse than death. All right, so that's the final warning given by Peterson here. He provides some encouragement that he draws out from the story as well. There's an exhortation here, and that exhortation drawn from the Jonah story is this. Even if you find yourself, like Jonah, in the abyss, fleeing from the divine conscience, fleeing from the command of God, there is still yet hope for redemption. Like Jonah, you too can repent. You can heed the divine voice of conscience. You can ascend again to the upward aiming path of psychological flourishing. So in Jonah, we see both calamity and we see redemption. We see a prophet who both descends and then ascends, who fails only to eventually succeed. And this is a source of great encouragement to us, says Peterson, in our own individual and societal struggle with the divine. All right, Andrew, that's my brief summary of what's happening here. What did you think of this chapter?
I think it is a great conclusion one. Sorry, I like your point about him sort of bringing the story full circle. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about this, there's so many individual points to talk about, but I kind of wanted to stress just three. The first one is going to be that Peterson's reading it treats a little bit of a universal humanity here that is being saved, right? Like a common culture, something along those lines. And I don't think he adequately draws out the absurdism of what Jonah is facing. Right. And so I love that he opens up, like Peterson has this amazing insight that he opens up with. He's like, Jonah is framed as essentially an everyman, right? There's kind of not an exceptional type character. One, this is a great motif that sort of is replete throughout biblical narratives, right? Abraham's not a particularly just exemplary guy, right? Even all the way to Jesus himself, when he comes, we're told later basically that Jesus, there's nothing about him that would cause us to just recognize him as divine or whatever, right? Like there was nothing along those lines that he physically represented in that sense, right? So there's a sense in which the everyman gets commonly called forth by God to use Peterson's kind of language, to the adventure of the story there. So it's a great opening remark. But I kind of wonder about the absurdism of what Jonah is actually communicating as the Israelite readers would have first heard. And it also makes it, I think, somewhat prophetic in terms of the sort of transformation in Judaism from a place wherein Judaism is localized in Israel with the temple, and then it's getting ready to be more or less taken over by other empires and dispersed across the land, right? The reason why I bring that up is because Peterson notes that the Assyrians are the mortal enemies of the Israelites. But again, I would stress a little bit further than this. These aren't just the mortal enemies. These are the people that one of the two people groups that would conquer Israel, that would plunder them and destroy them. And in the ancient world, when your God is, or when your nation is fighting another nation, it's also perfectly normal for them to view this as our God fighting their God, right? And so when one God conquers another God, it sort of shows the supremacy of that God. So if Israel is getting ready to fight Assyria and even be conquered by them, then isn't it sort of a damning thing to their notion of Yahweh that his people got conquered by the Assyrians? Well, also, if you've been sort of given the calling, as far as you understand it, you've been given the calling by God that you are the nation by which he will take dominion over the earth, retake dominion over the earth, and bring back this sort of Edenic state, right? Sort of a typical Israelite eschatology at that time. Then how strange is it that all of a sudden the prophet, the man of God, the man who in sort of an ancient understanding literally presences God to the world, right? How strange is it when that man gets sent precisely to the enemy that's going to conquer Israel and that's going to have their gods look like their gods defeated Israel? How strange is it that that's going to be the case? But one of the implications then that would make it even more absurd to an Israelite reader would be, or here at that time, right? One of the even stranger things would be, well, that would make it sound like Yahweh is actually on the Assyrian side. Yahweh cares about the Assyrians. He wants them to repent. Why does he want them to repent? What is he trying to do with this? So God is over the Assyrians now, all of a sudden. Yahweh is over the Assyrians. And so he is over the very people who will come and destroy Israel. Now, we hear an echo of this, or not an echo, but we hear a similar sort of narrative here with Isaiah. When Isaiah first, in one of the middle chapters, basically talks about I think it is a series. He's talking about he's going to raise up and he's going to bring them to punish Israel, and then he's going to punish them for punishing Israel, kind of deal. So there's a sense in which Isaiah also talks about, God using pagan peoples to punish Israel. But in Isaiah, there's no sense in which let me also save the Assyrians, right? There's no sense in which let me save those people I'm using to punish Israel. It's quite the opposite. Here, Jonah is tasked precisely with saving the people who are destined to say or to destroy God's people. And so this makes God's identity suddenly just radically in flux. I can imagine actually about the best parallel would be the Abraham and Isaac story. Because with Abraham and Isaac, you have Abraham having the son and the child of prophecy, basically the child of hope, that then God says sacrifice him, right? And for Jonah here, he has the calling of Israel here, the hope that Israel represents, and now he's effectively being called to sacrifice that by saving the people that are going to destroy them. Now, here's where I think this even symbolically gets further brought out, and that's to say that when Jonah gets thrown overboard in the ship, he gets swallowed by the Leviathan. And Peterson has an interesting section where he talks about like the high valuation of whales because they store a lot of blubber, and there's a lot. And it was a digression that I'm not really sure the value of that section. I hate to just be sort of dismissive. But the thing is, the Leviathan, I love that he recognizes the Leviathan. He gets some of the details on the Leviathan there. But if you go back to the notion of the Leviathan, I mean, it's linked to like the notion of Lotan in the Assyrian myth, or not the Assyrian, the Mesopotamian myths. And if you look at, for example, the Enuma Elish that he cites, you have essentially the fight with the dragon that Peterson loves talking about. That dragon, that cosmic chaos, the embodiment of cosmic chaos is Leviathan. That's the character. And so you can go to, for example, the Book of Enoch, you can go, where you have Leviathan being for the sea and Behemoth being for the land, right? This is a common motif you're going to find as well. But one represents the chaos on the land, one represents the chaos on the sea, right? And so how significant is it when you have the everyman of God, right? The everyman who is the man tasked by God being swallowed by the Leviathan in the exact same way that you have the people of God being swallowed by the Assyrians, right? So there's like a parallel going on there. And so what is it showing? Well, it's showing that God actually even is sovereign over the chaos, is essentially the message that I think is being communicated there, right? As much as anything. And so with God being sovereign over the chaos, and the fact that he even then sends his man to sort of, in a sense, redeem the chaos over here of the Ninevites, that the absurdism is, this is kind of like a first glimpse, if you will, of a universal salvation, right? A salvation that's not localized just in the Jews, but that is extended even to the Gentiles, right? And so you can have a glimpse of that, but you also have in the sense that this is, again, I would say God presiding over the chaos. And that's something that I was kind of really hoping that Peterson would, it seems like that's a theme that would be really ripe for him to, do his thing with. And he didn't exactly do that. It mostly ended up consisting in speak out, do not be silent. Silent is how evil literally wins. I think that's the last line of the chapter, even, where he says that if you stay silent, that is the equivalent of evil winning. And so there is that. There's another point that shows up as well, wherein he talks about how when we hold our tongue, when we know we should speak, that then we start wrestling with God. And I'm not entirely sure that's even necessarily the wisest way to go about this, because I don't think that's exactly what the story of Jonah is communicating. Again, I kind of think it's almost an absurdist narrative, where in the sense of like God makes absolutely no sense here, but the end result is he is sovereign. And that's, kind of this Job-like thing, or even this, Abraham called to sacrifice Isaac. I have no idea how this makes sense, but God told me to do it, ergo I do it. But for this narrative in particular, if the message is speak out when you know God has given you a message, well, there have been plenty of times, especially anyone who's been through seminary knows that there are plenty of times when you're studying the Bible and you're like, I got it, man. This is a great idea. This is brilliant. People need to hear this. And you present it and your professor goes, here's why that's the stupidest thing I've heard all week, right? And tears you down. And you're like, okay, all right. Admittedly, that was, okay. Maybe I didn't actually hear the word of God. Maybe I just said something stupid and thought I did, right? And particularly, though, if we give into what we feel the conviction to say in any particular moment, well, two things about that. One is it seems like that would be being led by the heart, right? And the Bible tells us that the heart is deceitful above all else and desperately wicked. So, always we need to be careful that we do not conflate the Holy Spirit, the movement of the Holy Spirit, and our emotional state and the heart. Because the thing is, if you're equating the Holy Spirit and God here with just the highest moral principle that's operative in you, and that it has these echoes that reverberate throughout your being, then it would seem like Peterson is unable to actually distinguish between the two. The movement of the Holy Spirit would be felt in a kind of a superego kind of a conviction, right? And I think that would be a very dangerous thing for a couple of reasons, but one of them would be Slavoj Žižek. I cite him regularly, right? Met him a couple of weeks ago. Yay. But the thing is, Peterson, debated Slavoj Žižek. For those fans of Peterson that are familiar with him, Slavoj Žižek has this really great kind of joke that he tells about the superego injunction to make sure that we get the significance of it. And that's to say that the superego functionally is the part that always is condemning us. It's always putting burdens on us and saying, do this, do this, do this, and you're condemned if you don't. And the point of the superego is that it's never satisfied. And so Zizek brings out, he says, yes, this is essentially the same as the old Stalinist maxim, basically, that the man is innocent. That's even more of a reason to shoot him, right? There's no actual innocence before the superego. And so the more you give into the superego, the more it demands. And so there's no ultimate resolution to be had there. And if we can't distinguish between God and between our emotional states, then the superego reigning over everything would actually just lead us to chaos as well. Because it'd just be like this universal, extreme puritanical kind of behavior. And I don't think Peterson knows better about that than I do, because he's the psychoanalyst, for crying out loud. He's the guy that knows this stuff backwards and forwards. So I don't think he's communicating that. But if we're not taking a critical approach to that, I think it'd be very easy to see what he's saying is just, you feel the message, you need to get it forward, and it's always just going to be now giving over to these superego injunctions that'll never be satisfied. So then, there's a lot to say. I don't want to take too long. So then I guess another point would be the sacrificial point that Peterson's been making, that we need to sacrifice certain things along the way that are even our deepest values, just as we need to sacrifice them for the highest value, essentially. And this point, I kind of almost wonder if it's, I was surprised it didn't come back again as well, because in essence, what Jonah is being called to do in this absurdist reading that I'm giving of the text, maybe I shouldn't say absurdist, in this reading of the text wherein God makes no sense to us, right? One of the things that Jonah would be called to do would be ultimately to give up his highest, the locus of value that he has, right? His highest principle of value. This is salvation. I'm being called to give up salvation for whatever else God's doing that doesn't make sense to me. Seems like that would be a good way to practice even the sense of sacrifice that Peterson's been developing over the last several chapters. And so I know I said only 3 things. I actually got 2 more things I want to bring up. So one of them would be, Jonah's presented as an everyman in this chapter. On page 466 to 468, early in the chapter, there's this really interesting comparison to Socrates. Essentially, Peterson wants to say that the two are parallel figures, that if we read them in terms of the literary significances of these characters, that they are functioning in parallel ways. And so Socrates has, to a lot of Christian readers, it's jarring when they first hear that Socrates claims this. I know people to this day that have always thought that this is like a concession that Greek philosophy is demonic. But Socrates has this statement where he says that he has a demon that he follows. Now, the word here is daimonion, and ultimately this is a kind of spirit. It doesn't mean demon yet in language. It's going to take it a while before it's going to mean something like demon. But what really he's talking about is like the voice of conscience, in terms of like what Peterson's going to understand him as saying. Socrates says, I have this conviction from the voice of conscience. And he actually follows this conviction unto death. Yeah. Jonah, by contrast, gets this conviction and then runs in the other direction. And Peterson's somewhat sympathetic to it. He's like, yeah, of course you would, because he's being called to go to a people that will probably kill him for doing this. Socrates listened to it, and he did die. So there are very real stakes here. But still, he makes the comparison, and it's essentially that the two are tasked with the same thing: speaking up so that the people can hear the word of truth, which would be the word of God, and therefore be saved. Actually, it sounds like I've probably gone long enough. I got 4 more points I could say, but that's probably enough for now. So,
well, on the Socrates one, it's funny because he introduces Socrates as a foil, a literary foil to Jonah, like you said, to contrast with Jonah. Whereas Jonah runs, Socrates goes headlong on his conviction to the point where, I mean, the Athenians wanted to give him a way out. And they even asked him, Socrates, what do you think your punishment should be? And in a hilarious passage in the Apology, he says, well, I think you should pretty much feed me and take care of me on the state's dime. That would be a good punishment for me. So he's asking for it. I mean, he actually, just when he's about to get off, he ticks everybody off, and it eventually ends in his taking of the hemlock. So interesting comparison there. But unfortunately, Socrates' daimon, his demon, is not equivalent to Peterson's understanding of conscience, because Socrates tells us that this daimon doesn't tell him what to do. It doesn't tell him what to say. It doesn't tell him to speak this or that. Rather, it's only kind of a negative force. It only ever warns him of certain actions that he should not take. So it functions like some kind of a spiritual stop sign for Socrates. So it was a stretch. Were you going to say something there?
Yeah, there was something else with it, that there's the sense in which on page 475, Peterson remarks that Jonah's guidance here is, in a sense, to flee to the devil that you know rather than the God that you do not. Right? There's a sense in which that's what he's reading Jonah as doing in his failing to do what Socrates was tasked with doing. If we, grant for the sake of argument his reading of what Socrates was tasked with doing. And this, reflects back to the earlier thing that he talked about with the Soviet Union, when, there's the fall of the Soviet Union, and for whatever reason, the people that even lived through Stalin pined for the days of Stalin rather than for the new kind of chaos out of which order would be produced. And then the other thing, too, along those same lines, is that this also is reflective of the Israelites in the deserts, that, they pine for the days of Egypt instead of the chaos of the desert wherein they are at the moment. And so there's that sense in which this can be, I think, axiomatized in that phrase, better the devil you know than the God you do not. Here's the problem, I think, given the reading that I was giving of this Jonah, which I think would also steelman Peterson's defense of Jonah for a little bit, which is to say that the problem with the God that you do not know is that what this God is revealing himself to be sounds like the exact opposite of what, right? Like, I mean, think about what an Israelite would think if we are God's people, we are the source of his salvation. Marduk is their God, right? Or Baal is their God, right? And Baal is their view of salvation. And by the way, God just came to me and said, save them so they can conquer us. It sounds like Baal, right? It sounds like Marduk. It sounds like the wrong God here. And so it would even make sense from like a pious perspective to run from that. And so I think there's a lot of levels of absurdity here that show up, in which case, even like for Socrates' daimon, I think Socrates' daimon would be precisely the voice that goes, hold up, that's not Yahweh. That can't be. That sounds like Baal.
Good point.
Don't follow that. Right?
Good point. Yeah, so in a sense, Socrates could be a foil of Peterson's, the very point that Peterson's trying to make. Yeah, I think just to say something on the story of Jonah, I think it's shocking. Like you said, how shocking this would have been for Jonah and for the Israelites. This command of God to be merciful to the Ninevites, to Assyria. I just don't think we can appreciate just how jarring of a command this would have been. I mean, not only was Assyria the mortal enemy of Israel and would eventually conquer them, but the Assyrians were just brutal. I mean, you're talking about one of the most brutal empires the world has ever known. I mean, they were bastards. I mean, they were nasty.
Yeah.
So I like your hermeneutical points that you're making about the story of Jonah. So much deeper truths there that could have been mined. But anyway, some interesting things about this chapter that stand out to me. I mean, Peterson gives us this interpretation of hell as hell on earth. So it's not it's not a domain of divine judgment. Rather, it's kind of a state of life that we create for ourselves. So hell for Peterson is like a living hell, right? It's a state of being that's characterized by immature narcissism and self-serving hedonism, envy, spite, arrogance, deceit, that kind of thing. There is a very interesting passage on page 475 where Peterson talks about evil as the best evidence for God. I've heard him refer to this argument before in interviews and stuff, but he seems to be saying on page 475 that if evil really exists, well, then good really exists, since knowledge of evil implies knowledge of good. Something is evil insofar as it is not good. So the inference that he's making here, which goes obviously undeveloped, he's not trying to make a philosophical argument, but he's saying that if some things are really and truly evil, then it should follow that some things are really and truly good. But this means that the implication here is that there must be a universal good, right? A transcendent good. So that's a really interesting section of this chapter. Once again, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one thing to give him here, that's the same way that C.S. Lewis opens Mere Christianity, right? Because he opens up with I think it's the example of you're sitting on a bus and somebody steals your seat and you're like, hey, that's wrong, yeah. Right? And the point is that in that acknowledgement, you immediately recognize that there's what he ends up calling the law of human nature. That is to say that we recognize good and evil, and therefore there must be a source of the good. And so it's kind of, there's a sense in which he's repeating in that point, like at least a very popular apologetic kind of argument today.
And Peterson himself has spent a whole lot of time studying the great regimes of the 20th century. He has spent so much time focusing on the atrocities of communism and Nazism. And so Peterson is a man acquainted with evil. So this is a really powerful argument from him because he's very clear-eyed when it comes to the fact that what we have here are examples of universal objective evils. And so for him, this is really powerful because it kind of cries out that he has to believe, it implies that he has to believe in some kind of a standard, some kind of a universal good. So he finds it very compelling. So this is where you'll see him kind of give that little argument. Once again, in this chapter, Peterson kind of positions himself against both the biblical skeptic and the biblical literalist. This has kind of been a recurring theme. He wants to critique both those who approach the Bible just in order to criticize it, but he also wants to critique those who approach the Bible as if it were something intended to be understood in a woodenly literal way. And he makes a statement here that I think is true. He rightly notes that it's a mistake to confuse the notion of true with the notion of literal. And I think that's a good statement. That's a true statement, that we shouldn't confuse these two ideas. So that's a good point that he makes. He has more to say. Again, another recurring theme. He really likes to take the radical environmentalists to task whenever he can. Jordan just likes to throw a punch at the radical environmentalists, and I have to say I love watching it when he does it. He just excoriates them in this chapter again for elevating nature above man, basically in the hierarchy of human values, of ultimate values. And then you mentioned before what he does with the whale. Well, the whale of the Jonah story comes in for some serious tropifying in this chapter. I count at least 3 tropes identified by Peterson with respect to the whale in the story. The first is that the whale represents the beast of the abyss. He calls it the maw of Hades that awaits those who descend into the hell of their own making. Number two, the whale is a symbol, like you said, of a storehouse of immense value in the form of the traditions and institutions bequeathed to us by our ancestors. And finally, he talks about the whale, he talks about the belly of the whale as the abyss that must be journeyed to in order to rescue the lost tradition and basically like the spirit of the patriarchs. And this is where he brings in the Pinocchio story, which it's really remarkable. Jordan Peterson, it seems like in this book, he's using the Bible and the story of Pinocchio over and over and over again to make his points. He really likes that story. But I was
in the Lion King.
In the Lion King, yeah.
Yep.
So there's a lot of trouble. If you want to see Peterson, pulling out archetypes, look at what he does with the whale and the Jonah and the whale story. It's a perfect example of the way he thinks. And what's really amusing about it is that there isn't even a whale in the Jonah story. So he uses this concept of a whale to pull from it all these tropes, but the biblical text just talks about a great fish. So
that caught me off guard because of all things, he's known for he's a good guy to go into. He's not a materialist reader all the time, right? Like he's known for looking for the symbolic weight, and so these symbolic elements don't have to even have a literal figure in them. So that's why I was a little bit curious why he didn't deal more with the Leviathan as Leviathan, because you mentioned that he refers to him as the maw of Hades, but that's about it. Like that really goes undeveloped in terms of his account of this whale, and that was the closest I think he gets to actually dealing with the symbolic significance of that beast in this story. And so I was a little bit shocked because I would think the full embodiment of the dragon of Hades or the dragon of chaos, given especially that he's known for this sort of narrative of, the hero fighting the dragon, basically, I was really surprised that he didn't do anything with this. I figured that would be where he's going to take off.
I mean, the chapter was a little bit on the short end for, I don't remember how many pages, but it felt like a shorter chapter. So, like I said, I think he's using the Jonah chapter to kind of wrap things up. Yeah. So, anyway, the Jonah chapter is really the final chapter of the book. Peterson does provide a short concluding chapter, but it's really just kind of an executive summary of the various themes that he's presented throughout. So, Andrew, let's conclude this series of episodes with some final summary thoughts about the book as a whole. So let me start, and then I'll turn it over to you. So how would I characterize this book? Well, if I were to give a short summary, it would be this. In We Who Wrestle with God, Peterson utilizes Old Testament narrative, especially as found in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, as a vehicle to express his own idiosyncratic, Jungian-inspired ideology. So rather than getting an exposition of the texts that he considers throughout, what we actually get in this book is a psychologized analysis of the text. That's what's happening here. Now, this is not to say at all that this is a bad book. As long as you know what he's up to, it's not a bad book. There's a lot in this book that I like. In fact, I happen to agree with Peterson with his take most of the time. My problem with the book isn't really what he says as such. Rather, my problem is the way that he so often forces the biblical text to say it. And this is something that we've talked about several times now. So I'll actually just leave that here. We can talk about it more if you want, but this is something we've brought up a lot in terms of a criticism. All right, so let me say something about the conception of God that we're given in this book. The subtitle of the book is Perceptions of the Divine, and Peterson's expressed intent is to give us something like a progressively unfolding characterization of God. So how does he do on this score? Well, as I've said many times throughout this series, what Peterson gives us in the book is a thoroughly functionalized and psychologized characterization of God. Peterson's idea of God seems to be that of a radical immanentism in its best iteration, or that of a pantheism or panentheism in its worst iteration, I think. Throughout the book, God is identified or equated with the necessary universal abstract structure of human consciousness, or that upward aiming spirit or force within the deep collective human psyche. And what is most significant to me is what is lacking in Peter's characterization of the divine in this book. We don't get here anything approximating the classical or historical, and I would argue the biblical portrayal of God as a personal, transcendent creator. Peterson nowhere in this book articulates in any clear sense a creator-creature distinction. And as I've noted several times throughout this series, a God for Peterson seems to be something like a vital and immanent force within the psyche to be aligned with, rather than a personal, transcendent creator to be worshiped. And this explains why Peterson concludes the book the way he does. At the very end of the book, the last 2 pages of the book, in fact, Peterson asks whether or not the God he's been talking about for 500 pages is actually real. This is a question he ends with. And his answer is that whether or not God is real is a matter of definition. The question of whether God is real, in other words, is equivalent to the question of whether the upward aiming spirit or force of the collective human psyche is real. And of course, thanks Peterson, the answer to that question is undeniably and even necessarily yes. So Peterson says that not only is God real in this sense, according to this definition, but we all inevitably and unavoidably struggle or wrestle with this God in the unfolding of our lives. That is, through our aims and our intentions as we choose to heed or choose to ignore the voice of conscience. So at the end of the day, Peterson is just not interested in the question of whether a transcendent creator God exists. In fact, he thinks that the question itself, the question, does God exist, is just confused and poorly conceived. And I suspect, and this is a little bit me reading between the lines here, that this claim doesn't amount to a denial of any ontological proposition about God. I don't think that Peterson's denying that God exists in this robust, transcendent, ontological way. Rather, I think what's happening here is Peterson is being affected by his adherence to a certain epistemology. We've talked about this before. It's something like a Kantian transcendental idealism. And Peterson seems to think that we simply are not in a position to consider this kind of ontological claim. We're not in an epistemic position. And with the early Wittgenstein, his thought seems to be that what we can't talk about, what we are not equipped to think about, we have to pass over in silence. So Peterson refuses to address the question of God's ontological existence. He refuses to tip his hat one way or another, as it were, in relation to his own view on whether or not such a God actually exists. Because at the end of the day, I don't think he thinks it's a question that we can even think about. I don't think just like he did with the question of the afterlife and whether or not the soul survives death, I don't think he believes that it's something that the psyche can even consider. So at the end of the day, that's why we're left in this kind of cloud of confusion, and all the best that we can do is a psychologized, functionalized view of God. Again, I'm not claiming that Peterson disbelieves. That's not his view. It's more complicated than that. All right, Andrew, put a bow on this thing for us.
Okay, put a bow on this 500-page book. I appreciate it. Yeah, let's see if I can do this. So I apologize for the next 2 hours. All right, now uh, jumping in, I want to say that there's to sort of build on that. I think in his conclusion, like you said, he mostly just does a quick run through of the whole book. And in fact, if you don't have time to read 500 pages, you really could just read that final chapter, and that's about everything. Um, he and to that end, I might be a little bit reductive here, but I think we can ultimately reduce it to mostly 3 points that he gives us. That one is that he's trying to call us to a spirit of voluntary creative engagement with the world, right? And so chaos is going to be sort of the chaos of our pre-engagement with the world, and so we're trying to engage this chaos and create order, right? So then that's sort of what we're called to. That's the fundamental core of the spirit that he wants to bring us to. And then there's, of course, a directedness to it, which is that it has to be an upward journey. So then I've pointed out, I think in every episode, that Jacob's ladder gets mentioned at least once in every single chapter. In the Jonah chapter, we haven't brought it up yet, but it gets mentioned again here, right? And so Jacob's ladder kind of is about everything for him, right? It's that upward ascending approach to the highest good, of course, being God. And of course, that requires that we recognize that there is a higher good beyond ourselves. And that, of course, generates the third point that he keeps stressing, which is the Luciferian antagonist. And the Luciferian antagonist is where we always place the self in some capacity over God. We replace God with the self, and then everything literally goes to hell from that point on. And so that is just, in essence, those are the three main points that are just always at contest throughout every single chapter, and that also come through, I think, pretty clearly in his conclusion. In terms of like the criticisms and so forth, given the emphasis on Jacob's ladder, we've heard talk about, and especially in politics, about bridges to nowhere, right? But there's a worry that I think every Christian has, that this is maybe a ladder to nowhere, right? Because if God is nothing more than, if all that we can know of God is the sort of moral consciousness that he grounds, and that he that I'm referencing there is actually nothing more than just potentially a figment of my imagination, then so what? You never get past the so what question there. It's almost just dismissed. And I mean, the so what, I guess you could answer it with the pragmatic sense, right? Of, well, your life will go literally to hell in a handbasket if you do that, because if there is no God to be above you, then you're going to place yourself there. And that's a pragmatic thing. I mean, pragmatism dies by pragmatism's sword, basically. So, right, like it's a good argument until I find something better that I want. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily strong enough in terms of what he hopes to accomplish. I don't think it's just a naive reaction of the 20th century to the death of God that all of a sudden morality just collapses, right? There is a very real sense to that. And for Nietzsche, Peterson's fond of bringing Nietzsche into the discussion. Nietzsche's talking about the impossibility of man to fill the shoes of God. There's a line that he says, he gets the line ultimately from, he talks about the infinite ocean, and he gets that from this book by Philippe Meinlander. It's The Philosophy of Redemption. And Meinlander has this idea of the death of God that, in a sense, can be read as scaling the Jacob's ladder here, right? For Meinlander, we're scaling the vertiginous mountain of being until we're trying to reach the highest possible being, and we discover that there's nothing there. And so for Meinlander, what we discover is, in essence, the corpse of God. That, yes, there is this order of being, but there's no actual living God at the top. And so he just talks about it in terms of, I like to call it a theogonic suicide, which is to say that it's a theogony of sorts. It's the birth of God, but it's also the birth of God as the death of God, because it's not something that can be sustained. And so really the sense of being that we have is the corpse-like sense of being, where it bespeaks of a thing that doesn't exist or that we can't get to, right? And so Meinlander talks about how dangerous it is then to sail out on the infinite ocean of this void of God. And Nietzsche, I think, is doing that. So Peterson is fond of talking about the parable of the madman. So that comes from Nietzsche's book, The Gay Science. But the one right before that is called, Nietzsche speaks in an aphoristic way. So he just has blocks of text. And a lot of times each block of text will have sort of like an italics title to it. And so this one is In the Horizon of the Infinite. And he literally evokes Mindlander's description of this sort of infinite ocean here. And he's saying, little ship, look out. You're basically on the infinite ocean. And if anybody has read Mindlander would know that Mindlander says all of the ships will capsize in this infinite ocean. And so there's no way that they can sail out into the sea. And so then Nietzsche carries that over into the parable of the madman. When he then says, one of my favorite lines in the whole parable, he says, I will tell you, we have killed him, killed God, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How can we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Right? There's that sense of the infinite ocean that consumes us. We don't consume it. It's not even possible. It's this naive aspiration to even do so. And so the very being who kills God is himself destined to die by the end of this. And so there's that struggle that sort of emerges here, that if there's not a very real terminus, ultimately what you're going to be discovering is going to be the highest pinnacle of human existence. And so you're still going to be trying to make man swallow up the infinite ocean at some point. And that is precisely the thing that caused the collapse of theism and all these moral beliefs in the 20th century. So can
I ask you something in regard to that? The more I listen to Peterson, and after reading this 500-page book, it seems like Nietzsche is always in the back of his mind. Yeah. Always. And in a sense, it even seems like this notion of wrestling with God is, again, this is just me trying to read into it. I can't think of anything he says in particular, but it almost seems like this notion of wrestling with God is wrestling for meaning in the face of absurdity. Mm-hmm. And like I said, he's constantly has Nietzsche in the back of his mind, and he thinks Nietzsche is brilliant, and he thinks he's deadly. And Peterson feels like you have to fight, or you're going to be swallowed up in this kind of nihilism that results if we give up hope and faith in the Petersonian understanding of faith in the existence of God. What do you think about? Do you see Nietzsche behind Peterson in his thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's partially because I'm a Nietzsche fanboy, so I'm going to say that I see Nietzsche behind everything. Yeah. So there's a sense in which that's kind of going to be unavoidable for me. But for Peterson, I definitely see that. And actually, this wasn't one of the points I was originally going to make, but this is kind of something that I think does come to the fore if you're going to be wrestling with Nietzsche here. Tolkien actually talks about this in his essay on Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, the sort of major essay that sort of launched him into a bigwig of classical scholarship. And what Tolkien talks about is the pagan ethic. And the pagan ethic is essentially one wherein it's always a warrior ethos. And it's a warrior ethos that's fighting and combating the collapse into chaos, because the gods endure forever, man does not. And so everything that you're doing, everything that you're building will eventually collapse and die. And so the best you can do is stare into the abyss and shout your name so it knows who's coming to join it, right? Like you can basically shout your name because I have done these great things that don't matter. And then you die, you're gone. And so really it's the futility of the shouting that is the ground of their ethic, if you will. And so Tolkien has this really great line where he says something to the effect of, that they could only conceive of things in pure tragedy because each of the men, such as Beowulf is a man, and for him that's tragedy enough, because there is no enduring value that can exist. And so it almost seems like in the absence, like if we're thinking everything in the wake of God's death, right? And that's sort of where Peterson has us, and he's trying to get us to preserve what we can of the corpse of God, right? In terms of this system of valuation, then all we ultimately could resurrect is something akin to this pagan system of just shouting your name into the abyss, right? Because again, it's going to fail. It's going to falter. It's going to end. Even if every single generation practices what he's going to say we should practice, eventually there's going to be the heat death of the universe, and it's going to end, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so there's like the best we can hope for is something like that pagan sense of like, for us, everything would be tragedy because we're human beings. And so to kind of turn that around it's not just that he's trying to resurrect meaning, but he's trying to turn it around in the sense of like, here's a guiding, orienting purpose. Yes, it's a struggle. And yes, he never wants to just sort of be this la la land kind of guy that dismisses the struggle. But I do think that he kind of sees this as a sense in which you can live a positive and fulfilling life. And the problem is the fulfillment is precisely what the pagan ethic recognized to be missing, because it's all going to die. And I don't think he ever gets past that.
No.
And so that's kind of that's kind of where I would see Nietzsche is lurking behind him. And the best he could then do is resurrect the pagan ethic here.
One that ultimately fails. I think that if you understand Peterson in reference to Nietzsche, I mean, his project is an utter failure unless he brings in the notion of a transcendent creator God. He absolutely needs that notion to respond to Nietzsche.
Can I read? I think I read this before in our discussion of Fear and Trembling, but I think Kierkegaard nails it here. I mean, like I'm a Kierkegaardian. I'm always going to go back to him, right? But he opens up Fear and Trembling with this really great section where he says, "If there were no eternal consciousness in man," emphasis on eternal. If there were no eternal consciousness in man, if at the bottom of everything there were only a wild ferment, a power that twisting in dark passions produced everything great and inconsequential, chaos and order. If an unfathomable, insatiable emptiness lay hid beneath everything, what would life be but despair? If it were thus, if there were no sacred bond uniting mankind, if one generation rose up after another like the leaves of the forest, if one generation succeeded the other as the songs of birds in the woods, if the human race passed through the world as a ship through the sea or a wind through the desert, a thoughtless and fruitless whim, if an eternal oblivion always lurked hungrily for its prey, and there were no power strong enough to wrest it from its clutches, how empty and devoid of comfort would life be? Like that opening right there, I think, is precisely the point that Peterson can never get past.
Yeah, I agree. And he has to articulate, he needs an ontology, as we've said before. He has to tell us, he has to tip one way or another. You know, he has to fall into some kind of a pantheism or some kind of a theism. Or else I just think he doesn't have the tools that are necessary to respond to Nietzsche.
And you know who else it kind of leads him to not be able to respond too well to here? And I think he would probably want to fight me if he heard me say this, is one of the guys he criticizes more than anyone else, and that is Michel Foucault. And Foucault in this book ends as sort of one of I think it might be the most famous thing that Foucault ever wrote. And Foucault ends the order of things with this meditation on the death of God. And I want to, before I read what he says there, I want to note what Peterson writes on the very last page of the book, page 505. He puts in Latin the last words, Deus renatus est, which roughly translates to like God is reborn, right? And so keep that in mind. God is reborn here, right? God is not dead. May have died, but now he is reborn. And there's a historical significance for Peterson here, insofar as I don't think it's overly hyperbolic at all to say that Peterson himself is probably more than any other figure responsible for the death of the new atheist movement and the rebirth of the openness to the question of God in the present milieu. I think he's definitely the guy that did that. Because he opened this up to the emptiness of materialism as like a cultural point of discourse, right? And it's very rare that you're going to find people in major figures that have sort of returned to God, even somebody like Joe Rogan, who hasn't returned to God, but now who used to be very much a new atheist kind of guy and now is very open to these questions, right? Peterson is the guy that everyone's going to cite, and with good reason. He's done a great job doing that. However, to quote Foucault here at the end of this, his meditation on the death of God, it's page 385. It's third from the last page of the book. Foucault writes that in our day, once again, Nietzsche indicated a turning point from a long way off. It is not so much the absence or the death of God that is affirmed as the end of man. It becomes apparent then that the death of God and the last man are engaged in a contest with more than one round. It is not the last man who announces that he has killed God, thus situating his language, his thought, and his laughter in the space of the already dead God, yet positing himself also as he who has killed God, and whose existence includes the freedom and decision of the murderer. Thus, the last man is at the same time older and yet younger, than the death of God. Since he has killed God, it is he himself who must answer for his own finitude. But since it is the death of God, since it is in the death of God that he speaks, thinks, and exists, his murder itself is doomed to die. New gods, the same gods, are already swelling in the future ocean. Man will disappear. Now, the main takeaway is that God died because of a specific formulation of man, that locked man and God in this constant headbutting. And so they were kind of two sides of the same coin. And the problem with that is you can't destroy one side of the coin without destroying the whole coin, right? Because they're essentially, again, two sides of the same coin is the same being. You destroy one half of it, well, you've actually destroyed the whole thing, right? And so what's emerging then is that new men will, in fact, not survive God's death, but reproduce new gods. There are new gods that will emerge out of the swelling chaos of the infinite creativity of the human potential, right? And so there are new gods that will emerge. Well, isn't this interesting that Peterson is here ending his book by heralding the birth of the new god? Right? God is reborn. That's a very interesting statement. It's not that he is resurrected from the dead, it's that he is reborn. New gods are swelling in the sea. Now, I think that is an interesting point in and of itself. And it also means that I think our criticism has been, as much as anything throughout the entirety of the book, that he is almost too situated in the present moment. This isn't just a return to theism that he's inaugurated. It's a very specific kind of return to theism. And that very specific kind of return to theism is one that ultimately sidelines the entirety of the salvific message and instead produces a God who is a God of, Peterson wouldn't necessarily be reduced to this per se, but the zeitgeist has a God of the affirmation of the self, right? This is a God of the self, right? This is, in essence, you could almost see it as a deification of the self, precisely because, as I've noted several times now, he openly says that all of these stories are ultimately about you, right? It's we who wrestle with God, and God, we don't even know if he's a transcendent being. He's a transcendental being, which doesn't get us to an actually existing God. It just gets us to the potential of a highest moral principle from whence we know not where it came, right? And so the thing is, the rebirth of God, it strikes me as, again, Justin Brierley's book, The Surprising Rebirth of the Question of God, right? It strikes me as interesting to that end. Or Belief in God, sorry for the title of the book. Justin Brierley, look it up. It's a great book. Anyway, the thing about that is, this is a very specific pragmatic sense of Christianity. Why become a Christian? Because it pragmatically works. Again, history's going to go on, and what was pragmatic in one age is going to be just incredibly inefficient and worth rejecting in the next. And in fact, by a Petersonian notion of the sacrifice, what's pragmatic in one age will have to be sacrificed for progress in the next, right? So I don't see that as a good argument for believing in God here. But the pragmatic age returns to Christianity, again, for pragmatic reasons, and we see this in a number of major figures. I think we can take Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who used to be one of the major new atheists, as a great case example for this. And so she herself writes, and I just wanted to quote her here. She herself writes on her famous, kind of now infamous even, Return to Christianity. She says in an interview, I forget where it was, she says, why do I call myself a Christian now? Part of the answer is global. Western civilization is under threat from three different but related forces: the resurgence of great power, authoritarianism, and expansionism in the forms of the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's Russia. The next one is the rise of global Islam, which threatens to mobilize a vast population against the West. And the third one is the viral spread of woke ideology, which is eating into the moral fiber of the next generation. She continues, we endeavor to fend off these threats with modern secular tools, military, economic, diplomatic, technological effects to defend, bribe, persuade, appease, and surveil. And yet, with every round of the conflict, we find ourselves losing ground. We are either running out of money with our national debt in the tens of trillions of dollars, or we are losing our lead in the technological race with China. But we can't fight off these formidable forces unless we answer the question, what is it that unites us? The response is that God is dead seems insufficient. So too does the attempt to find solace in the, quote, rules-based liberal international order, end quote. The only credible answer, I believe, lies in our desire to uphold the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So here, what is the Judeo-Christian tradition? It is a moral tradition. It's really firstly and foremostly a moral system. And that point about unity is really interesting because what does Peterson say at the beginning of 504, next to last page? He writes ultimately that in these characterizations of God, all the characterizations presented in this book, sort of ... leading into this part of the sentence, he says, God is presented as the unity that exists as the foundation or standard at the pinnacle. And this he then mobilizes at the end of the book, at the end of the page to say, we are therefore by necessity those who wrestle with God. If we do that while gazing heavenward, we can align ourselves with the reality that is eternal and walk with God while we keep and dress the paradisal garden. So basically, it's the civilizational hope. That's precisely what Ali is citing here as her hope. And so it seems
and for Peterson, it would also be, I'd say, it's also a matter of the kind of necessary elements of psychological and societal flourishing for Peterson. So it's not just we need a unified story to respond to these other stories that are gripping society, but he actually thinks that the rod of tradition found in these ancient texts is needed. It's necessary for psychological and societal flourishing. Yeah. At the psychological level. He likes to use, so two phrases I'll remember from this book are by definition and by necessity. Those are two phrases that he likes to use over and over and over. And I agree. There's a kind of pragmatism here. But also, someone might push back. Someone did push back in one of the comments of one of our early videos. And they said that we've left out this concept of the psychoid, because Carl Jung also had this idea of the psychoid. It wasn't just some subjectivist kind of understanding of the human psyche where we just happen to have these beliefs that are foundational for the structure of consciousness. But there was almost this metaphysical layer to reality where the spiritual and the physical meet and interact. And there was this idea of the psychoid. So I'm not even saying that Peterson can't respond to Nietzsche. I'm just saying that if he's going to do it, he needs to bring some other conceptual tools in. He needs to bring some other ontological equipment in, or this is just going to be what you just represented there in Ayaan Hirsi Ali. It's just going to kind of be a pragmatic response mechanism, or a story, a counter story to Nietzsche and to some of these other societal movements and ideologies.
And I'm not sure. I need to study Jung more. Definitely. I mean, I need, just in general. Peterson's made that abundantly clear. I'm not sure that the psychoid can get us to God, though, because it seems like
neither am I.
Yeah, I think the psychoid connects us with the created order. It doesn't connect us with the creator. Right, it connects us and I think Peterson's exemplifying why that's the case by the fact that he can't get to God with his own reasoning. Presumably, I would think built the factoring that psychoid into this. So this is the problem is that this would be an archetypal way for framing our daily existence in the created order. And the problem is God is not in the created order. He is beyond the created order and necessary for the created order. And so we need that thing that gets us beyond this. It's not something that makes sense of creation. It's something that gets us beyond creation. Right. And that's what we need. And so I don't think that would even necessarily be a countermeasure. And the other thing too, though, is so long as God then remains sort of in essence of being like not something beyond the created order, but more or less almost like the exogenous factors framing the created order, the axioms, if you will, of the created order. The problem is the axioms are always in flux in every age. That's not an historically debatable point, right? And so his definition of tyranny here is that you have an individual who's placed themselves at the highest point, right? But if there is no actual transcendent God at the highest point, and what we have is the transcendental God, who ultimately, as I keep arguing, is reducible to just the human, it's just the highest framework of the human here, then that is what we are always going to be doing in every case that we follow the highest good, i.e. God, so long as he's not transcendent. Because what else are we doing? We have already placed the human there. Now we just need to qualify the human. Which human? And that's always what the tyrant is going to be doing. And I don't think we can escape so long as we can't get to the transcendent, the inevitable argument, and this is the objection of the cynical age that we live in, is that that's just your, that's just your straight white God, right? Or that's just your, who knows, that's just your whatever God, right? Like this is just your gay God, or whatever you've placed up there, like whatever cultural dynamic force that is ruling at the time, that's what they're going to place there. And you need something beyond that to be able to actually say, yeah, no, that's idolatry, that's tyranny. Here's the actual good. And so I think that is a problem in and of itself. And if I can actually conclude what I have to comment on this with a little bit of a reference to wisdom from the good book, Thomas Aquinas.
There it is.
Thomas Aquinas, Summa Contra Gentiles on God, Volume 1. He says, he has this wonderful meditation on the office of the wise man that he opens up Summa Contra Gentiles with. And I think this actually gets at what we want from Peterson so much. And so I hope I don't come across as too critical of him. It's mostly that I'm holding him to the standard of the wise man. And I know that he is a wise man, and this book is filled with wisdom. But there's that frustration that I'm pushing back on. And it's precisely because I think he's actually missed the target of the wise man here.
Agreed.
Right?
Yep.
And so the point is that Aquinas opens up with, again, the study of the wise man. And he notes that there's a ton of different sciences. Every single science actually has its object. And every science is properly studying this object and presents a kind of wisdom relative to each science. So you have a kind of wisdom that comes with an excellence in your understanding of biology, a kind of wisdom that comes with your excellence in your understanding of the economy, something like that. But he says the problem is there's a highest science. Right? There is a highest one that is above all. And this is the one that studies ultimate principles. This is ultimately the one that studies ultimate being. Right?
That's right.
And he says, the name of the absolute wise man, however, is reserved for him whose consideration is directed to the end of the universe, which is also the origin of the universe. That's page 60 here of this book. And the problem is, this is fundamentally the telos of the entirety of creation for Aquinas, and I think he's right in this, right? And so let's just localize it in man. God is the telos of man, right? That you have made us for yourself, O God, and the heart is restless until it rests in thee. Right? Famous words of Augustine in the opening of the Confessions, right? And the thing is, I've mentioned it before, there is the medieval principle that the form of the thing, the nature of the thing, follows its telos, its end goal, its purpose. So the analogy is, the easiest one is like a knife is defined by its purpose of cutting. And so this tumbler makes a horrible knife because its telos is not that of cutting. Its telos is containing a drink, right? Its end purpose is that, right? And so what happens, though, is that the end goal orders the form of the thing, the nature of the thing, to function in this way. And so if you don't have a telos, you don't have a functioning order. You do not have a form. And so what the death of God represents is the death of precisely that ultimate purpose that the wise man is seeking after, right? That ultimate being that is beyond creation, that the wise man is there to study, that fundamental principle that is needed. And so in the absence of that, you have a formless man. And so you are going to be imposing forms on man that can be ultimately, and that's back to the tyrant point, that are always going to be trying to fill the void of what's ultimately unfillable, to fill the void of the absence of man, not just of God, because God and man are two sides of the same coin on this model that they're using, right? And so for Aquinas, he's saying, no, God and man are not the same. We need to actually order ourselves beyond this created order. And that is the office of true wisdom, the highest principle, which is then going to be theology.
That's right. That's a good way to end this, actually, Andrew. I appreciate you doing that. And let us not forget that Aquinas there is simply parroting Aristotle, who makes those same claims in his Metaphysics. And he says that the wise man is the man who doesn't just consider causes and principles, but the highest causes and the highest or first principles. And he calls this study first philosophy, or the divine science. And so this, you're exactly right. This is what Peterson needs. Peterson needs to get back to an ultimate reality. That's what he needs. He needs to outline for us. He needs to present to us what is for him the ultimate reality. and the ultimate explanation. And he needs to show us the way, and that's the way of wisdom. Aquinas goes on to say that the wise man not only thinks about, not only considers things from the perspective of their ultimate causes and first principles, but then, once he has discovered these ultimate causes and first principles, what does he do? He says he orders his life according to it. He orders his thinking, he orders his life according to it. And so yes, at the end of the day, as we have said multiple times throughout, what's lacking, this is a good book. It's worth reading. Lots of really good insights. As I said, I agree with Peterson more often than not in his assessments. But there's a big hole in this book. And that hole can only be filled by an ultimate metaphysical reality, speaking from the perspective of philosophy and metaphysics, and by a transcendent personal creator, speaking from the perspective of theology. That's what this book needs. And let's pray that one day Peterson comes to see that.
Absolutely.
All right, Andrew, well, thanks so much for doing this with me. We Who Wrestle with Jordan Peterson. This has just been tons of fun.
Yeah, it has. I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.